The night Vivian Osei-Bonsu walked into the gala at the Fairmont Royal York, no one recognized her. That was the point. She had not been in Toronto's architecture circles for 3 years. Not since the divorce. Not since the settlement that quietly erased her name from every project file, every presentation deck, every framed photo in the Callaway and Marsh studio lobby. She had driven up from Hamilton that evening in a rented car, parked 2 blocks away, and stood for a long moment outside the hotel's revolving doors, watching the light pour out onto Front Street like something warm that no longer belonged to her. She went in anyway. The atrium was full. The Royal Ontario Museum Architecture Prize Gala drew the industry's best. Partners from firms across Ontario, clients worth billions, journalists from Azure and Canadian Architect, junior associates who'd been waiting all year for the chance to stand in a room like this. The chandelier overhead threw gold across the marble floor. Someone was playing a grand piano near the south windows. Waiters moved through the crowd with champagne and small plates of charcuterie that no one actually ate. Vivian moved through the room, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time learning to take up very little space. She was 41 years old, and she had spent the last 36 months of her life becoming someone her former husband would not immediately notice at a party. His name was Colin Marsh. 47, silver at his temples now in a way that read as distinguished rather than aged. Wearing a dark navy suit that she recognized because she had helped him pick it out at a King Street boutique the Christmas before everything fell apart. He was standing near the bar with the easy confidence of a man who expected the room to arrange itself around him, and it did, it always had. Beside him stood a woman named Petra. No, that wasn't right. She had heard through a mutual friend that he'd remarried, someone younger, someone who worked in marketing at a development firm downtown. She couldn't see the woman's face clearly from across the room and didn't try to. Vivian accepted a glass of water from a passing tray and found a position near the far wall, beside a column draped in soft gray fabric where she could see the stage. She was not here for Colin, she was here for the envelope. The Callaway and Marsh studio had been built on one project, the Meridian Complex in Waterloo, a mixed-use development that had won the firm its first major national award 7 years ago and opened every door that followed. Clients came from Alberta, from British Columbia, from New York. Colin had been photographed for Toronto Life. He had given a TEDx talk in Ottawa. He had stood at the podium of half a dozen industry galas and spoken about vision, about risk, about what it meant to build something that lasts. Vivian had designed the Meridian Complex. Every drawing, every structural consideration, every decision about the way light would move through the central atrium at different times of day. Calculated by hand in a notebook she still kept on her bedside table, because she hadn't been able to bring herself to throw it out. She had been 34 when she started the drawings. They had been married for 2 years. Colin was the face of the firm. His family name was on the door, his social ease moved clients from interest to contract faster than any pitch deck, and Vivian had understood early in the partnership that this was how their arrangement worked. She brought the architecture. He brought the room. She had told herself this was practical, that it was a kind of collaboration, that many of the best architects in history had worked behind people with better connection and more comfortable access to wealth, and that the work itself was what mattered, that the Meridian would stand for 100 years, and the truth of who drew it would eventually surface, the way it always did. She had told herself a great many things during those years. The first time it happened in public, the first time Colin stood at a podium and said, "I designed" instead of "we designed," or even "our studio designed." Vivian had been sitting in the third row of an industry breakfast at the Sheraton. She had looked down at her hands in her lap and felt something move through her chest that she did not immediately have a word for. It was not quite shock. She had seen smaller versions of this pattern for years, had rationalized each one, had chosen her moment poorly and then not chosen it at all. She did not say anything. She drove home after the breakfast, sat in the parking garage of their Rosedale house for 12 minutes before going inside, and made a decision she would spend the next 4 years carrying out very quietly. She started saving everything. Not just the drawings. She already had those, time-stamped and stored on an external drive she kept at her sister's apartment in Scarborough. She started documenting the communications. The contractor emails where Colin was CC'd, but she was the one responding with specifications. The revision history on shared files. The consultant invoices addressed to her. The site visit logs signed in her handwriting. The structural engineer's notes that referenced her decisions by name, because structural engineers do not care about industry politics and simply record who told them what. She did this for 4 years. In year 3, she quietly retained a lawyer named Georgette Valcourt, a woman she had found through a reference from a colleague in Vancouver who asked no questions. And Georgette had been similarly quiet and thorough, and completely without sentiment about the situation. By the time Vivian finally filed for divorce, she and Georgette had assembled a documentation package that was, as Georgette put it, the clearest case of intellectual property misattribution she had seen in 20 years of practice. Colin had not seemed concerned about the divorce. He had seemed, if anything, slightly relieved, which told Vivian something she had suspected but not confirmed. He hired a lawyer who worked primarily in real estate and offered a settlement focused on the house and their shared financial accounts. He did not think to negotiate over the work. Vivian signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon in February. She moved to Hamilton. She took a position as a visiting lecturer at McMaster's architecture program, which paid modestly, and required her to be in rooms full of 22-year-olds who had never heard of the Meridian complex, which was, for a while, the most restful professional experience of her life. She did not speak publicly about any of it. She waited. The Royal Ontario Museum Architecture Prize was adjudicated by a rotating panel of 5 judges, and this year's panel included a man named This year's panel included a man whose name Vivian knew because she had read every piece of writing he had ever published. Because his practice had shaped her thinking before she had ever met Colin Marsh. His name was Frederick Okafor. He was 63 years old, Ghanaian Canadian, and had spent 4 decades building a body of work across 3 continents that was studied in architecture schools internationally. He was not flashy. He did not give TEDx talks. He wrote careful, rigorous essays in academic journals about the ethical dimensions of space and the responsibility architects held toward the communities their buildings inhabited. He had a slight formal manner in public that Vivian had heard described by people who didn't understand it as coldness. People who had read him more carefully recognized it as precision. She had sent him a package 6 weeks ago, not a letter, not an email, a physical package sent through Georgette's office, because Georgette's letterhead implied legal seriousness without making an explicit threat, containing a curated selection of the documentation, not everything, just enough. The early drawings timestamped. 3 contractor communication. A specific exchange with the Meridian structural engineer, in which Vivian had made a critical load-bearing decision, and the engineer had replied, very plainly, confirmed, I'll proceed with your specification. She had not asked Frederick Okafor for anything. She had included a single cover letter, 2 paragraphs, written and rewritten over the course of a week, until it said exactly what she intended and nothing more. The letter stated the facts of the Meridian complex's authorship. It noted that Callaway and Marsh had submitted the Meridian as part of the firm's portfolio in support of Colin Marsh's nomination for tonight's Lifetime Achievement distinction. It said she was not seeking press coverage or a public dispute. It said simply that she believed Frederick Okafor, as a judge of this prize, deserved to make his decision with accurate information. She had not received a reply. She had not expected one. She had come tonight because Georgette had advised her to, in the carefully indirect way Georgette had of advising things she believed strongly. It might be useful, Georgette had said, for you to be present, in case anything comes of this. And then she had looked at Vivian over her reading glasses with an expression that communicated rather more than in case anything comes of this. So Vivian stood near her column and watched the room and sipped her water and waited. Colin found her before the program started. She saw him notice her from across the room, the slight pause in his expression, the recalibration that happened behind his eyes when he understood who he was looking at. He excused himself from his group with the smoothness of long practice and crossed the floor toward her. Vivian. He said it the way he said most things, pleasantly, as if the pleasantness itself was the substance. Colin. He glanced around the room briefly, checking she understood whether anyone was watching them. A few people were. This was a small industry. People had known them as a couple. I didn't know you were coming tonight, he said. It's an open gala. Right. He put his hands in his jacket pockets, which was a gesture she's associated with him managing something he hadn't anticipated. How's Hamilton? It's good. I enjoy the work at McMaster. Teaching. He said this with a faint shift in his voice that was not quite dismissive. Colin was too careful for open dismissiveness. But that communicated a kind of gentle pity for the distance between where she had ended up and where she might have been. She let the silence sit for a moment. I should get back, he said finally. Allegra gets nervous at these things when I'm not. She's not from the industry. Of course. He moved away. She watched him go. She felt very little, which was different from feeling nothing. It was the particular quality of feeling that comes after a long time of feeling too much, and she recognized it as a kind of clarity. Across the room, Frederick Okafor had arrived. He was tall in a dark suit, and he was speaking with 2 women near the stage entrance. He did not look in her direction. She had not expected him to. The lights dimmed slightly. People began moving toward the tables. The program ran the way these programs always run. An opening address from the presenting sponsor, a video package about the prize's history, 3 category awards given out with brief speeches and polite applause from an audience whose attention was beginning to drift toward the dinner course. Colin was at a table near the front, visible to Vivian from her position slightly to the left of the main floor. He was performing ease with the confidence of someone who had been performing ease at industry events for 20 years. The Lifetime Achievement Award was last. Frederick Okafor was introduced as the lead adjudicator for the distinction. He walked to the podium with the unhurried manner of someone who was not thinking about how he looked walking to the podium, which meant he looked in fact quite good walking to the podium. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the room for a moment before speaking. The Lifetime Achievement distinction in this prize is not given for a single project, he began. It is given for a body of work, for the accumulated evidence over a career that a practitioner has brought something essential and lasting to the built environment. It is the most serious award we offer because it is the most total. We are not recognizing a moment. We are recognizing a life of work. The room was quiet. Frederick Okafor had a way of speaking that created quiet. This year's adjudication process required us as a panel to return several times to questions that we do not always ask as directly as perhaps we should. Questions about authorship, about whose name appears on a drawing and whether that name belongs there, about the ethical foundations of what we do, not just the structural or aesthetic ones, but the ethical ones. Colin's posture from where Vivian stood had shifted almost imperceptibly. He was still composed, but his hands, which had been resting easily on the table, had moved. The portfolio submitted in support of tonight's nominated recipient included work from the Meridian Complex in Waterloo. Frederick Okafor continued. Our panel, in the course of its due diligence, came into possession of documentation related to that project. We take questions of attribution seriously. We are architects. We build things that last, and we understand, or we should understand, that what we build includes the record of who built it. He paused. The room held very still. It is my honor tonight to present the Royal Ontario Museum Architecture Prize for Lifetime Achievement, not to the name that was originally submitted. Colin's chair moved, just slightly, an inch, maybe less, backward from the table, but to the architect whose hand is documented in the record, across the project that defined a decade of this city's architectural identity. An architect who, for reasons she has chosen not to speak publicly about, has spent several years teaching in Hamilton while her work was celebrated under a different name. He looked up from his notes for the first time. He looked with uncomplicated directness across the room to the far left of the floor, where a woman in a dark dress was standing near a gray-draped column with a glass of water in her hand. Vivian Osei-Bonsu. She did not move immediately. It was not that she hadn't prepared for this moment. She had, in some abstracted way, in the same sense that you can prepare for something you cannot actually fully imagine until it is happening. She had thought about what she would do if Frederick Okafor's due diligence led him here, if the panel acted on the documentation, if this evening became what Georgette had quietly suggested it might become. But she had spent 3 years making herself small, and the body, it turned out, did not immediately forget that. It was the applause that moved her. Not the polite industry applause of earlier in the evening, but something different. A few people started it, and then it spread in the organic, contagious way of something that felt true to the people participating in it. She heard someone near the front say her name again, once quietly to their companion. The way you say a name when you are suddenly placing a thing you had not quite understood before. She walked toward the stage. She was aware of Colin's table as she passed it. She did not look at him directly, but her peripheral vision registered that he was sitting very still, the way a person sits when they are working very hard on an expression of composure, and the composition is not fully holding. Frederick Okafor met her at the base of the stairs and extended his hand. She shook it. Up close he was very calm, not cold, the way people who didn't read him described it, but precise. He held the handshake a moment and said quietly, so that only she could hear it, "The Meridian Light study, the calculations in the second notebook, that was yours." "Yes," she said. "I know that kind of thinking," he said. "I recognized it when I saw it." He handed her the award and stepped back to give her the podium. She stood there for a moment and looked out at the room, the chandelier, the champagne glasses catching light, the faces. Some she knew, most she didn't. A few that were watching her with expressions of something that looked like recognition or relief, or the particular emotion that does not have a precise English name but exists in the feeling of watching a record get corrected. She thought about the notebook on her bedside table in Hamilton. The pages dense with light calculations that no building permit filing would ever capture, that no press release had ever described, that had simply existed, in her handwriting, with her numbers waiting. "I want to say," she began and then stopped, because she had prepared remarks and they suddenly seemed wrong. She set them aside. "I want to say that I came here tonight not knowing what would happen. I came because someone I respect told me it might be useful to be present." She paused. "I've spent 3 years wondering whether the work itself was enough, whether it would find its way back to the record, whether patience was wisdom or just another word for letting things go that shouldn't be let go." She found, without looking for it, the face of a young woman near the right side of the room, a junior associate by the look of her, early 20s, sitting forward very slightly in her chair. Document everything, Vivian said. Whatever you build, wherever your name does or doesn't appear, keep the notebooks, keep the emails, keep the time-stamped files. Not because you expect to need them. Keep them because the work is yours, and the record of the work is yours, and the truth has a way of requiring evidence when it finally decides to surface. She picked up the award. Thank you. The applause followed her back down the stairs and across the floor, and she moved through it the way you move through water when you are not quite sure yet of the depth. Frederick Okafor fell into steps beside her briefly. Are you staying for dinner? He asked. I wasn't planning to, she said. He nodded, as though this was the sensible answer. There will be people who want to speak with you. Not tonight, perhaps, but this will move. I know. How long have you been at McMaster? 3 years. I lecture on structural integration. Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He considered this. There's a position opening on our advisory board, he said in the same even tone he used for everything else. I'd like to send you the information, nothing imminent, but worth knowing about. Yes, she said. Send it. He moved toward a group of people who had been waiting with the carefully managed patience of people who want to speak with someone important. She continued toward the edge of the room. She did not look for Colin on the way out. She had wondered for years whether she would want to, whether there would be a version of this moment where she found his eyes across the room and waited for the satisfaction of it. But the truth was that what she felt, walking across the marble floor of the Fairmont Royal York atrium with an award in her hand, was not triumph over him. It was something simpler and much older and much more hers. It was the feeling of a record that had been wrong for a long time becoming right again. She pushed through the revolving door and stood on Front Street. The November air was sharp and smelled of the lake 2 blocks away. The city was going on around her. Taxis, a streetcar grinding past on King, someone's conversation floating from a restaurant doorway. All the regular texture of a Thursday evening in downtown Toronto. She stood there for a moment, the award under her arm, and breathed. Her phone was in her bag. She had a message from Georgette, sent 4 minutes ago, that read, I heard, well done. 3 words, which was effusive by Georgette's standards. She had a message from her sister in Scarborough that was 17 emojis and no words at all, which required no interpretation. She had a missed call from a number she didn't recognize, a 416 area code, Toronto, and she did not return it yet because she would have time for that. She understood now. She would have time for all of it. The work was documented. The record was corrected. The name on the building would not change. Buildings did not work that way. But the notebooks were hers and the prize was hers. And Frederick Okafor knew what kind of thinking produced a light study like the Meridian's central atrium, and he had recognized it on the page without being told. She walked toward her rental car. Behind her, through the glass of the revolving door, the gala was still going on. Music had started again. The crowd was reforming into smaller conversations, the way crowds do after something unexpected happens, breaking and regrouping around the new shape of things. She did not go back to see it. She had a drive to Hamilton and a Tuesday morning lecture to prepare, and a notebook on her bedside table that had been waiting a long time to be useful again. She unlocked the car, set the award carefully on the passenger seat, and drove.